The scream tore through the manor before dawn, and Elira knew, even half asleep, that something had gone wrong forever. She was 8 years old, standing barefoot on the cold stone floor of the hallway, when 2 guards from the Royal Road Patrol carried her mother's shawl into the entrance hall. It was torn and stained. There was no body to bring home yet, they said. The carriage had gone off the cliff road during the night storm. Both her parents were gone. Elira did not cry that night. She stood frozen, watching the adults around her whisper and exchange glances that did not match their words of comfort. Something about the crash did not sit right with the head steward, an old man named Bennett who had served the family for 30 years. He kept saying the horses on that road never spooked, not once in all his years, and the storm had not been strong enough to push a carriage over the edge. Nobody listened to him. Within a week, Elira's uncle, Cassian Vantros, arrived at the estate with a folder of papers and a lawyer trailing behind him. He wore black, out of respect, but his eyes did not carry grief. They carried calculation. He gathered the household staff in the main hall and told them that as the only surviving Vantros male relative, he would be assuming control of the estate, the title, and all matters concerning young Elira's upbringing. He said it smoothly, like a man reciting lines he had rehearsed for weeks, not days. Bennett, the old steward, tried to object. He said the estate and title belonged to Elira by direct inheritance, and that Cassian's role should only be as her guardian until she came of age, not as the new head of the house. Cassian's expression flickered, just for a moment, into something cold. Then he smiled, and told Bennett that grief was clearly affecting his judgment, and that perhaps it was time for an old servant to retire. Bennett was gone within 3 days. Nobody saw him leave. Nobody asked where he went. From that point forward, the manor changed. The warm portraits of Elira's parents were taken down from the main hall and replaced with new tapestries, bearing Cassian's own family crest. A crest that did not belong to House Vantros, but to his mother's side, a lesser house with no real standing. Elira noticed this immediately. Young as she was, she noticed everything. She had always been a quiet, observant child, the kind who remembered exact words people said and the exact tone they used to say them. She remembered exactly what her uncle said to her on the 7th night after the funeral that never happened, because there had been no bodies to bury, only an empty ceremony with 2 closed caskets. He called her into his new study, the room that used to be her father's, and sat behind the desk with his fingers laced together. "You understand your situation now, don't you?" he asked her. Elira, small and pale, nodded without understanding at all. "Your parents are gone. This house, this title, everything that was theirs, now falls under my authority, until a suitable arrangement can be made for you. You will not use the family name in public. You will not claim any right to the estate. You will live here. You will be fed. You will be clothed. But you will earn your place like everyone else who works in this house." Elira did not fully grasp what he meant until the next morning, when a maid came to her room, not to dress her as a young lady, but to hand her a plain gray uniform and tell her that Lord Cassian wanted her in the kitchens by sunrise. She was 8 years old, and she scrubbed her first pot before the sun had fully risen over the eastern hills. The years that followed blurred together in a rhythm of exhaustion. Elira grew up folding linens instead of attending lessons, carrying water instead of learning letters, standing silently in corners while her cousins, Cassian's own children, sat at the long dining table, eating meals she had helped prepare. She was never allowed to sit with them. She was never allowed to speak unless spoken to. She was never called by her real name in front of guests. To the household, to the world outside the estate walls, she was simply the girl, or sometimes, when Cassian was in a particularly cruel mood, the orphan who owes us everything. There were nights she cried into her thin blanket in the small servant's room she had been given, a room that used to belong to a stable hand before he left for better work elsewhere. There were nights she stared at the ceiling and tried to remember her mother's voice, and found that with each passing year, the memory grew fainter, harder to hold on to, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. But Elira was not a girl who broke easily. Somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12, something inside her hardened into quiet determination. She began to notice that the other servants, though instructed to treat her as one of their own, sometimes looked at her with pity, and occasionally, when Cassian was not watching, with something closer to kindness. An older cook named Marta would slip her an extra piece of bread when meals ran short. A stable boy named Colin would let her sit with him during her rare moments of rest and tell her stories about the outside world, about the capital city, about knights and dukes and grand tournaments held in the kingdom's honor. It was Colin who first taught her to recognize letters, tracing them into the dirt with a stick behind the stables where no one could see them. Elira absorbed everything he showed her with a hunger that surprised even herself. Within a year, she had taught herself to read, using old, discarded books she found in a forgotten corner of the manor's library, a room she was technically forbidden from entering, but which no one bothered to check, since the family rarely used it anymore. She read by candlelight, after her chores were finished, hiding the books beneath a loose floorboard in her room. She read about history, about geography, about the great houses of the kingdom and the wars that had shaped its borders. She read about honor and duty, and the strange, old codes that knights and nobles were supposed to follow. Codes that made her wonder, with a quiet bitterness, why none of them seemed to apply to her own uncle. She kept one possession from her old life, hidden always beneath her sleeve, tied with a thin cord so it would not fall from her thin finger. It was a ring, small and simple in design, bearing the true Vantros crest, the crest of hawk and flame that had once hung in the entrance hall before Cassian tore it down. Her mother had placed it on her hand the night before the accident, though Elira, at the time, had not understood why. She only remembered her mother's voice, soft and urgent, telling her to keep it safe, to keep it hidden, and to never let anyone see it unless the time was right. She did not know what her mother had meant by that. She only knew that the ring was the last piece of her family she had left, and she guarded it the way a person guards their own heartbeat, quietly, constantly, without ever speaking of it aloud. As the years passed, the manor's fortunes grew under Cassian's management, though not through his own skill. He had married into money through his wife, Lady Miriam, a woman as cold and calculating as her husband, and together they used the resources of House Vantros, resources that rightfully belonged to Elira, to build connections among the kingdom's nobility. Their 2 children, a son named Percival and a daughter named Clarissa, were raised with every comfort Elira had been denied. They wore fine silks. They studied with private tutors. They attended balls and gatherings in the capital, returning home with stories of dances and suitors, and grand halls filled with music. Elira listened to these stories sometimes, standing silently by the door with a tray in her hands, waiting to be dismissed. She never let her face show what she felt. She had learned, early on, that showing emotion in front of Cassian's family only invited cruelty. Clarissa, in particular, seemed to delight in finding new ways to remind Elira of her place. She would deliberately spill drinks for Elira to clean, or demand she redo a task that had already been done perfectly, simply for the satisfaction of watching her comply. Percival was quieter in his cruelty, more calculating like his father. He rarely spoke to Elira directly, but she often caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite place, something between curiosity and suspicion, as though he sensed there was more to her story than the household had been told. By the time Elira turned 16, she had become something of a ghost within her own childhood home. The younger servants who had joined the household in recent years did not even know her real name. To them, she was simply Elira the maid, a hard-working, quiet girl who kept to herself and never caused trouble. None of them knew that the blood running through her veins was the same blood that had once ruled these very halls. She had, by then, buried any hope of reclaiming what was hers. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing to carry in a house like this. It made the daily grind of labor feel heavier, made the ache in her back after long hours of scrubbing feel sharper, made the silence of her small room feel colder. So she stopped hoping. She focused instead on simply surviving each day, on keeping her head down, on making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible, because unnoticeable meant safe, and safe was the only thing she could afford to want anymore. Still, even in the depths of that quiet resignation, something inside her refused to fully die. Late at night, after her chores were done and the manor had gone silent, she would sit by her small window and look out at the stars, and something in her chest would tighten, with a feeling she could not name. It was not quite hope. It was something smaller, quieter, more stubborn. A refusal to disappear completely, even when the world had done everything in its power to make her vanish. She kept reading. She kept remembering. She kept the ring hidden beneath her sleeve, close to her skin, close to her heart, waiting for a reason to believe her mother's final words had meant something after all. 2 more years would pass in that same quiet rhythm of labor and silence, of stolen moments with old books and half-remembered dreams of a different life. 2 more years before anything in the manor would change. But change was coming, even if Elira could not yet see it. It was coming on the back of a black horse, carried by a man whose name was already spoken with fear and respect across the entire kingdom. A man who did not yet know that the quiet servant girl who would soon stumble in his path was carrying a secret that would shake the foundations of House Vantros to its core. For now, though, Elira knew nothing of what was to come. She only knew the weight of the tray in her hands, the ache in her feet after a long day, and the small, hidden ring against her wrist that reminded her, in her quietest moments, that she had once been someone else entirely. She did not know that her uncle had grown careless over the years, confident that his lies had settled too deep to ever be unearthed. She did not know that among the forged documents locked away in his study, there remained one small error, one detail he had overlooked in his rush to seize what was never his. She did not know that fate, patient and unhurried, had already begun setting its pieces into motion. All she knew, as she carried her tray down the long hallway one evening, past the very study where her father used to work, was that tomorrow would be another day exactly like today, another day of silence, another day of invisibility. She was wrong. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. The bell rang 3 times before dawn, which meant guests were expected, and guests meant Elira's day would begin an hour earlier than usual. She rose from her thin mattress in the dark, splashed cold water on her face from the basin in the corner of her room, and pulled on the same gray uniform she had worn for years, patched twice at the elbows, faded from countless washes. She tied her hair back quickly, tucked the hidden ring beneath her sleeve, as she always did, and made her way down the narrow servant staircase toward the kitchens. Marta, the old cook, was already awake, her hands deep in a bowl of dough, flour dusting her forearms like a light snow. She glanced up as Elira entered and gave a tired smile. "Big day today," Marta said. "Lord Cassian has invited someone important. I heard Lady Miriam shouting about it half the night. Wanted the good silver polished, the best linens brought out, everything perfect." "Who is it?" Elira asked, tying an apron over her uniform. Marta lowered her voice, as though the walls themselves might carry gossip straight to Cassian's ears. "Duke Roderick Ashcombe, the commander himself. He's touring the eastern provinces, meeting with the noble houses, building alliances before the winter campaigns begin. Lord Cassian's been trying to get an invitation to dine with him for months. Seems he finally succeeded." Elira had heard the name before, whispered in passing by the household staff, mentioned occasionally by Percival when he returned from his outings in the capital. Duke Roderick Ashcombe was spoken of the way people spoke of legends. Not quite real, larger than the ordinary world. He had led the kingdom's forces to victory in 3 separate border conflicts, had turned certain defeat into decisive triumph more than once, and was rumored to be the most formidable warrior the kingdom had seen in a generation. Some called him the Iron Duke. Others, more fearfully, called him the Kingdom's Storm, because wherever his banners appeared on a battlefield, chaos and destruction for the enemy inevitably followed. Elira had never imagined she would ever be in the same room as such a man, even as a servant carrying his wine. The day passed in a blur of preparation. Every surface in the manor was scrubbed and polished until it gleamed. The finest tablecloths, embroidered with gold thread, were brought out from storage. Cassian paced the halls all afternoon, adjusting his coat, rehearsing greetings under his breath, snapping at anyone who moved too slowly for his liking. Lady Miriam fussed over Clarissa's dress, insisting she look her absolute best, murmuring something about how a duke of such standing might make an excellent match for their daughter someday. Elira listened to all of this while carrying trays, arranging chairs, and polishing silverware until her fingers ached. She felt no excitement about the evening ahead. To her, it was simply another long shift, another night of standing quietly against the wall while the family she served pretended, for the benefit of a guest, that their household was warm and gracious and entirely without secrets. By the time evening arrived, the manor's grand dining hall had been transformed. Candles lined the long table, their flames reflecting off polished crystal glasses. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with warm golden light. Cassian and Miriam stood near the entrance, dressed in their finest clothes, waiting with practiced smiles as the sound of horses approached from the front drive. Illyra, along with 2 other maids, stood ready near the kitchen doorway, trays of appetizers prepared, waiting for the signal to begin service. Her heart, despite her attempt to remain indifferent, beat a little faster than usual. There was something about the tension in the air, the way the entire household seemed to be holding its breath, that made even her carefully guarded composure waver slightly. The doors opened, and Duke Roderick Ashcombe stepped inside. He was not what Illyra expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected in the first place. He was tall, certainly, with the broad shoulders and controlled bearing of a man accustomed to command, but there was nothing showy about his appearance. His dark coat was well made but simple, free of unnecessary ornamentation. His hair, a deep brown streaked faintly with premature gray at the temples, was cut short and practical. What struck Illyra most, from her position near the kitchen doorway, were his eyes. They were sharp, pale gray, and moved across the room with the quiet, assessing gaze of a man who noticed everything, who missed nothing, who had likely survived as long as he had, precisely because he never let his guard down. Cassian greeted him with an exaggerated bow, his voice pitched higher than usual, with poorly concealed nervousness. "Your Grace, it is truly an honor to welcome you to our home. We have prepared everything to your comfort, I assure you." Roderick inclined his head politely, his expression unreadable. "Lord Vantros, I appreciate the hospitality." The group moved toward the dining table, and Illyra, along with the other maids, began their work, weaving quietly through the room with trays of food and drink, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, always careful to remain unobtrusive, to move like shadows rather than people. This was the skill she had perfected over 10 years, the art of being present without being seen, of serving without existing. The conversation at the table drifted through pleasant, meaningless topics at first. The weather across the eastern provinces, the state of the roads, polite inquiries about mutual acquaintances. Cassian steered the conversation carefully, clearly hoping to impress the Duke with talk of his family's standing and influence, though Illyra noticed, even from her position near the wall, that Roderick's responses remained measured, almost distant, as though he were listening for something beneath the surface of the words being spoken. It was nearing the 3rd course of the meal when it happened. Illyra was carrying a tray of fresh bread toward the table, moving carefully between the chairs, when Clarissa, seated near the end of the table, extended her legs slightly, seemingly by accident, directly into Illyra's path. Illyra did not see it in time. Her foot caught against Clarissa's ankle, and she stumbled forward, the tray tilting sharply in her hands. She managed, through years of practiced reflexes, to keep the bread from spilling entirely, but in the process of catching her balance, her sleeve slipped down her extended arm, exposing her wrist for just a brief moment before she could pull the fabric back into place. It was only a second, perhaps less, but it was enough. Duke Roderick Ashcombe, seated across the table with a clear line of sight to where Illyra had stumbled, went very still. His eyes had caught the flash of gold at her wrist, the small ring tied with its thin cord, and something in his expression shifted, though it happened so quickly and so subtly that no one else at the table seemed to notice. Cassian was too busy glaring at Illyra for her clumsiness, already opening his mouth to offer a hurried apology to his guest. Clarissa was smirking faintly, satisfied with the small cruelty she had inflicted. Lady Miriam was fussing over a stain that had not actually landed on the tablecloth. But Roderick's gaze remained fixed on Illyra's wrist for one long, careful moment before she managed to pull her sleeve back down and straighten herself, murmuring a quiet apology and stepping back toward the wall. "Clumsy girl," Cassian muttered, loud enough for the table to hear, though not quite loud enough to be considered a proper scolding in front of company. "My apologies, Your Grace. The help here is not always as refined as one might hope." Roderick did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was calm, measured, giving nothing away. No harm done. Accidents happen. But his eyes, Illyra noticed as she retreated further toward the kitchen doorway, flicked toward her one more time before returning to his plate, and there was something in that glance that unsettled her far more than she wanted to admit. It was not the look of a man who had simply witnessed a servant's clumsy stumble. It was the look of a man who had seen something, recognized something, and was already turning it over carefully in his mind. Illyra spent the rest of the meal in quiet unease, careful to keep her distance from the table, careful to keep her sleeves pulled down as far as they would go. She told herself she was imagining things, that the Duke's glance had meant nothing, that a man of his standing would have no reason to take notice of a servant girl's jewelry. But some instinct, old and quiet and buried deep beneath 10 years of careful survival, told her otherwise. The meal eventually drew to a close. Cassian and Roderin retired to the study for private conversation, discussing matters of alliance and trade that Illyra was not privy to. She and the other maids began the long process of clearing the dining hall, extinguishing candles, gathering dishes to be washed. It was well past midnight by the time her duties for the evening finally ended, and she made her way, exhausted, back toward the small servants' quarters where her room waited. She did not know, as she climbed the narrow staircase in the dark, that Duke Roderin Ashcombe was, at that very moment, standing near the window of the guest chamber he had been given for the night, staring out at the moonlit grounds of the Vantros estate, his mind turning over a memory from many years ago, a memory of a man he had once served under, a commander he had respected above all others, a man who had worn a ring exactly like the one he had glimpsed on the wrist of a servant girl that evening. A ring bearing the crest of Hawk and Flame, the crest of House Vantros's true bloodline, a crest reserved only for the firstborn daughter of the family, passed down through generations, never given lightly, never worn by anyone outside the direct family line. Roderin had seen that crest only once before, on the hand of a woman he had met briefly many years ago, a woman who had died, along with her husband, in an accident that had always struck him as strangely convenient, given the timing of her brother-in-law's sudden rise to power. He did not yet know the servant girl's name. He did not yet know her full story. But he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who trusted his instincts above almost everything else, that something about tonight's dinner did not add up, and he intended to find out exactly what it was before he left this estate. He said nothing of this to Cassian during their private conversation in the study, choosing instead to keep the discussion strictly to matters of trade routes and military support for the upcoming winter season. But as their conversation drew to a close and Cassian rose to escort him to his chambers for the night, Roderin made one quiet request that caused a flicker of unease to cross Cassian's face. "Before I depart tomorrow," Roderin said, his tone casual, almost offhand, "I would like a moment to speak with the young maid who served us tonight, the one who stumbled near the end of the meal." Cassian's smile faltered for the briefest instant before he recovered it. "Of course, Your Grace. Though I must say, she is a rather simple girl. An orphan we took in out of charity years ago. I doubt she would have anything of interest to say to a man of your standing." "Nevertheless," Roderin said, his gray eyes steady and unreadable, "I would appreciate the opportunity." Cassian bowed his agreement, though his mind was already racing, already trying to understand why the kingdom's most powerful duke would take any interest whatsoever in a servant girl he had known for less than a single evening. He did not sleep well that night, turning over the possibilities in his mind, unable to shake a growing sense of unease that had settled deep in his chest. Illyra, meanwhile, slept fitfully in her small room, unaware that her carefully guarded secret had already been noticed, unaware that the quiet, unremarkable life she had resigned herself to was about to be shaken loose from its foundations, one careful, deliberate step at a time. Tomorrow, the Duke would ask to see her again, and nothing in her life would ever be the same. Morning came too quickly, as it always did, but this time, there was a different weight to the air inside the manor. Illyra felt it the moment she stepped into the kitchen, before anyone had said a single word to her. Lady Miriam was already awake, standing near the pantry with her arms crossed, her expression tight with irritation. When she saw Illyra enter, her eyes narrowed sharply. "You," she said, pointing a thin finger. "The Duke wishes to speak with you before he departs. Do not embarrass this household. Say as little as possible, keep your eyes down, and answer only what is asked of you. Do you understand?" Illyra nodded quickly, though confusion churned inside her chest. She could not imagine what a man like Duke Roderin Ashcombe could possibly want with her. She searched her memory of the previous evening, wondering if she had done something wrong, some mistake in her service that had drawn unwanted attention. though she could think of nothing beyond her small stumble near the end of the meal. She was given no time to prepare further. Within the hour, she was summoned to the small drawing room near the front of the manor, a room typically reserved for important guests, a room she had cleaned countless times but had never once been permitted to sit in. Duke Roderin Ashcombe stood near the window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back, dressed once again in the same simple but well-made traveling coat from the evening before. He turned as she stepped inside, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Illyra kept her eyes lowered, as instructed, her hands folded carefully in front of her, doing her best to appear unremarkable, unimportant, the way she had trained herself to appear for 10 long years. "You may look at me," Roderin said finally, his voice quieter than she expected, without the commanding edge she had heard him use with Cassian the night before. "I have no interest in formalities this morning." Slowly, cautiously, Illyra lifted her gaze to meet his. His pale gray eyes studied her, with an intensity that made her want to look away again, though something in his expression was not unkind. It was careful, considering. "What is your name?" he asked. "Illyra," she answered quietly, then hesitated, unsure whether to add anything further. In the end, old habit won out, and she said nothing more. "Illyra," he repeated slowly, as though testing the sound of it. "How long have you lived in this household?" 10 years, Your Grace." "And before that?" Illyra's hands tightened slightly in front of her. This was dangerous territory, questions she had been forbidden from answering honestly for as long as she could remember. She glanced toward the closed door, half expecting Cassian to burst through it at any moment, though the hallway beyond remained silent. "I do not remember much before that," she said carefully, the lie feeling heavy and awkward on her tongue. Roderin's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, as though he had expected this answer and had already prepared his next move. He took a slow step closer, his voice dropping lower, more direct. "I noticed the ring on your wrist last night," he said. "The one with the crest of a hawk and flame." Illyra's breath caught in her throat. Instinctively, her hand moved toward her sleeve, though she stopped herself before the gesture could fully reveal itself, forcing her hands to remain still at her sides. She said nothing, but her silence, she realized with a sinking feeling, had already given away more than any words could have. "That crest," Roderin continued, watching her closely, "belongs to House Vantros, not the branch currently occupying this estate, but the true bloodline. The firstborn line. I have seen that crest only once before in my life, many years ago, on the hand of a woman I met briefly during my early years of military service." Illyra's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," she managed, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying her. Roderin studied her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, his stern expression softened, just slightly, into something almost gentle. "Her name was Lady Serena Vantros," he said quietly. "I met her when I was a young officer, barely 20 years old, newly assigned to serve under her husband, Lord Alden Vantros, during the border conflicts in the north. He was my commanding officer for nearly 2 years, before I was reassigned. He was, without exaggeration, one of the finest men I have ever known. Fair, honorable, fiercely protective of the soldiers under his command. He saved my life during a skirmish near the northern pass, at great risk to his own safety. I have never forgotten that debt." Illyra felt something shift inside her chest, a strange, disorienting mixture of grief and disbelief. She had almost no memories of her father beyond vague impressions. The sound of his laugh, the warmth of his hand on her shoulder, fragments too faded and incomplete to hold on to properly. To hear a stranger speak of him with such clear, vivid respect was overwhelming in a way she had not prepared herself for. "I was told," Roderin continued carefully, "that Lord Alden and Lady Serena died in a carriage accident some years ago, and that their estate passed to Alden's younger brother due to the absence of a suitable heir. I did not question this story at the time. I had no reason to. But now, standing here, seeing that ring on your wrist, hearing that you have lived in this household as a servant for 10 years, I find myself questioning a great many things." Illyra's eyes filled with sudden, unwanted tears, which she blinked back furiously, unwilling to break down in front of a man she had only just met, no matter how gently he spoke. "They had a daughter," Roderin said quietly. his gaze steady and unwavering. I remember hearing of her once, briefly, though I never had the chance to meet her myself before I was reassigned to a different unit. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old at the time. Illyra could not hold back any longer. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "I was 8, she said. "When they died, I do not fully understand what happened. I only know that my uncle arrived within days, and by the end of the week, I was scrubbing floors in the same house I once called home." The room fell into heavy silence. Roderin's jaw tightened, a flash of something dark and controlled passing behind his pale eyes, though his voice remained calm when he spoke again. "Does anyone else know who you truly are?" Illyra shook her head. "Only my uncle. Perhaps his wife. I have never spoken of it to anyone else. I was warned, many years ago, that if I ever attempted to reveal the truth, I would be thrown out of this house entirely, with nothing. At least here, I have shelter, food. It is not much, but it is something." Roderin's expression, for the first time since their conversation began, showed open anger, quickly controlled, and pushed back beneath a composed exterior. "You have lived as a servant in your own family's home for 10 years, he said quietly, "while your uncle has claimed a title and inheritance that were never rightfully his to take." "I have no proof of any of this," Illyra said quickly, fear rising sharply in her chest. "Please, Your Grace, I beg you not to speak of this to anyone. If my uncle learns that I have said anything at all, he will. I have no intention of exposing you to further danger," Roderin interrupted gently, though firmly. "You have my word on that. But I cannot, in good conscience, simply walk away from what I have learned here today. Your father saved my life. I owe him a debt I have never had the opportunity to repay. Allowing his daughter to remain hidden in servitude, while the truth of her birthright remains buried, is not a debt I am willing to leave unpaid." Illyra did not know what to say. 10 years of careful silence, of swallowed grief and buried hope, rose up inside her all at once, tangled and overwhelming. Part of her wanted desperately to trust this man standing before her, to believe that perhaps, after everything, someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, for the first time in a decade. But another part of her, hardened by years of disappointment and cruelty, warned her to remain cautious, to guard herself against hope that might only lead to further pain. "What do you intend to do?" she asked quietly. Roderin considered the question carefully before answering. "For now, nothing rash. Your uncle is not a man to be confronted carelessly, especially without solid proof to support any claims against him. I will need time to look into the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths, to gather whatever evidence may still exist regarding the true inheritance of this estate. In the meantime, I ask only that you trust me enough to remain patient, and to keep the ring hidden as you have been doing. It may prove important later." Illyra nodded slowly, though uncertainty still churned within her. "I must depart today, as planned," Roderin continued, "in order to avoid raising suspicion. But I will return. You have my word on that, Illyra Vantrose." Hearing her true, full name spoken aloud, after 10 years of being called nothing but the girl, struck Illyra with unexpected force. Her eyes filled with tears once more, and this time she did not fight them back quite as hard. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt insufficient for everything she was feeling in that moment. Roderin inclined his head respectfully, an unusual gesture for a man of his standing to offer a servant, though Illyra understood, with quiet clarity, that in this moment, he was not seeing her as a servant at all. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of footsteps approaching the drawing-room door. Illyra quickly stepped back, lowering her eyes once more, resuming the careful, invisible posture she had perfected over years of practice. Just as the door opened and Cassian entered, his expression carefully arranged into polite curiosity, though Illyra could see the tension simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "Your Grace," Cassian said, bowing slightly. "I trust your conversation with the girl was satisfactory." "Quite satisfactory," Roderin replied smoothly, his expression giving nothing away. "I was simply curious about the household staff. A habit of mine, when visiting new estates. It helps me understand the character of the family I am dealing with." Cassian's smile tightened slightly at the underlying implication of the words, though he said nothing further on the matter. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I have your horse prepared for departure?" "Please," Roderin said, and with one final brief glance toward Illyra, a glance that carried far more meaning than either of them dared express openly in front of her uncle. He followed Cassian out of the room. Elira remained standing in the drawing room for several long moments after they had gone, her heart still pounding, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. For the first time in 10 years, something had shifted inside her, something small and fragile, and terrifying in its possibility. Hope. She did not know yet whether to trust it. She did not know whether Duke Roderin Ashcombe would truly return, or whether his promise would fade into empty words the moment he rode beyond the estate's gates, forgotten among the countless other matters demanding a duke's attention. But as she made her way back toward the kitchens to resume her duties, her hand drifted briefly to her wrist, to the small ring hidden beneath her sleeve, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself, just slightly, to believe that perhaps her mother's final words to her all those years ago had meant something after all. Keep it safe, keep it hidden. Wait for the time to be right. Perhaps, Elira thought, watching the dust rise faintly on the road as the Duke's procession departed the estate grounds, that time had finally begun to arrive. Cassian did not sleep at all that night. He sat alone in his study, long after the household had gone quiet, a single candle burning low on his desk, his mind circling relentlessly around the strange, brief conversation the Duke had requested with Elira. He could not shake the feeling that something important had passed between them, something he had not been permitted to witness, and the uncertainty gnawed at him with increasing intensity as the hours stretched on. He told himself he was overreacting. The Duke was known for his careful, curious nature, for taking interest in the smallest details of the households he visited, a habit that had served him well on countless battlefields where noticing small details often meant the difference between victory and disaster. Perhaps his interest in Elira had truly been nothing more than idle curiosity, a passing observation about an unremarkable servant girl, forgotten the moment his horse crossed beyond the estate gates. But Cassian had not built his position through carelessness. He had spent 10 years constructing an elaborate web of lies, forged documents, and careful manipulation to secure the Vantros title and fortune for himself. And a man who builds such a fragile structure learns quickly to recognize even the smallest tremors that might signal its collapse. He rose from his desk and crossed to the heavy locked cabinet in the corner of his study, retrieving a small brass key from beneath a loose floorboard he had installed himself years ago, a hiding place known to no one but him. Inside the cabinet, wrapped carefully in cloth, lay the documents he had never dared destroy, the original inheritance papers naming Elira as the rightful heir to House Vantros, along with the forged replacements he had commissioned in the chaotic weeks following his brother's death, documents that falsely established him as the legitimate successor to the title. He had kept the originals, despite the risk, because destroying them entirely would have removed any possibility of reversing his position should circumstances ever require it. It was a decision born of caution, though standing there now in the candlelight, staring down at the proof of his decade-long deception, he wondered whether that caution had been a mistake. He locked the cabinet once more and returned to his desk, his mind turning over possibilities. If the Duke had somehow recognized Elira's connection to the true Vantros bloodline, if he intended to pursue the matter further, Cassian would need to act quickly and decisively to protect everything he had built. The following morning, he summoned Lady Miriam to his study and explained his concerns in low, urgent tones. Miriam listened with growing alarm, her carefully composed expression cracking slightly as the implications settled over her. "You believe he suspects something?" she asked. "I believe," Cassian said carefully, "that we cannot afford to take chances. The girl has always been a loose thread in an otherwise carefully woven tapestry. It is time we dealt with that thread permanently, before it has the opportunity to unravel everything we have built. What do you propose?" Cassian was quiet for a long moment, considering his options carefully. There is a minor lord in the western province, Lord Bartholomew Ashworth, who has expressed interest in taking a young bride. He is not a man of particularly refined taste or discernment, and he owes me a considerable debt from a business arrangement several years ago. I believe he would be quite receptive to a proposal involving Elira, particularly if I frame it as a generous gesture on my part, taking a poor orphan girl and securing her a respectable marriage despite her lack of standing. Miriam's eyes narrowed with understanding. A marriage far from here, somewhere she could not easily be found or questioned. Precisely, Cassian confirmed. Once she is married and settled in the Western Province, any lingering questions the Duke might have will find no answers. A married woman, under her husband's authority, is no longer a concern of ours, and Lord Ashworth's estate is remote enough that few people of importance ever visit. And if she refuses? Cassian's expression hardened into something cold and unyielding. She has no standing to refuse anything. She will do as she is told, as she always has. The arrangements moved forward with alarming speed over the following days. Cassian sent an urgent letter to Lord Ashworth, carefully worded to present the proposal as an act of generosity, while quietly reminding him of the debt he owed. The response arrived within a week, eager and enthusiastic, along with a formal request for the betrothal ceremony to take place within the month, followed shortly afterward by the marriage itself. Illyra knew nothing of these arrangements until Lady Miriam summoned her to the drawing room, the same room where she had spoken with Duke Roderin only days before, and informed her, with cold indifference, that she was to be married. Married, Illyra repeated, stunned, her mind struggling to process the sudden announcement. To whom? Lord Bartholomew Ashworth, of the Western Province, Miriam said, examining her nails with disinterest. You should be grateful. Few men would consider marrying a girl with no family standing, and no dowry to speak of. Lord Cassian has been more than generous in arranging this match for you. Illyra's mind raced, panic rising sharply in her chest. She had no personal knowledge of Lord Ashworth, but the timing of this sudden arrangement, coming so soon after the Duke's visit, felt far too deliberate to be coincidence. When is this meant to take place? She asked carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. The betrothal ceremony will be held here, at the estate, in 3 weeks' time, Miriam said. The marriage itself will follow shortly afterward, at Lord Ashworth's estate in the west. 3 weeks. Illyra's thoughts spun frantically. Roderin had said he needed time, that he would return, but he had given no indication of exactly when that return might occur. If she was married, and removed to a distant province before he came back, any hope of reclaiming her rightful place would likely be lost forever, buried beneath the weight of a forced marriage and the authority of a husband she had never met. She said nothing further to Miriam, understanding that any protest would only invite punishment and would do nothing to change the outcome. Instead, she retreated to her small room that evening, her mind racing through possibilities, searching desperately for some way to reach out to Roderin before the arrangements could be finalized. She did not know his exact location. She did not know how to send word to a man of such standing without alerting her uncle to her intentions. She had no allies within the household she could trust with such a dangerous secret, save perhaps for Marta and Colin, though involving either of them risked placing them in danger, as well should Cassian discover their assistance. Days passed in a haze of dread and desperate planning. Illyra continued her duties as though nothing had changed, careful not to arouse suspicion, while quietly turning over every possible option in her mind. She considered attempting to send a letter through one of the traveling merchants who occasionally passed through the estate, though she had no way of knowing where such a letter might reach the Duke, nor any guarantee that it would not be intercepted before it ever left the grounds. It was Colin, eventually, who offered a solution. Late one evening, as Illyra sat quietly in the stables during one of her rare moments of rest, staring blankly at nothing in particular, Colin approached her with unusual seriousness in his expression. "You've been distracted lately," he said, settling onto a hay bale beside her. "More than usual. Something's wrong." Illyra hesitated, weighing the risk of confiding in him against the growing desperation of her situation. In the end, desperation won out. She told him everything, in hushed, careful tones, watching his expression shift from confusion to shock as the pieces of her true identity fell into place. When she finished, Colin was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of what he had just learned. "I have a cousin," he said finally, "who works as a messenger for merchants traveling between the provinces. He passes through here regularly, and he has connections throughout the capital. If anyone could get word to the Duke's household discreetly, it would be him." Hope flickered cautiously in Illyra's chest. "Do you think he would help?" "I can ask," Colin said. "But Illyra, if your uncle discovers what we're attempting, the consequences could be severe, not just for you, for me as well, and for my cousin. Elira understood the risk clearly, but she saw no other path forward. I have no other options left, she said quietly. If I do not act now, I will be married and sent away within weeks, and any chance of reclaiming what is rightfully mine will be lost forever. Colin nodded slowly, resolve settling into his expression. Then I will speak with my cousin tomorrow. Write your message tonight, as carefully and discreetly as you can. We will find a way to get it to the Duke. That night, by the flickering light of a single candle, Elira wrote her letter with trembling hands, choosing her words with extreme caution, careful to avoid anything that might explicitly incriminate her, or reveal too much should the letter fall into the wrong hands. She wrote simply that circumstances had changed rapidly, that time was growing short, and that she prayed he would remember his promise before it became too late. She sealed the letter and hid it beneath the same loose floorboard where she kept her forbidden books, waiting anxiously for Colin's return the following day. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Elira, Cassian's suspicions had not entirely faded despite his hasty arrangements for her marriage. He had begun making quiet inquiries of his own, sending a trusted servant to gather information about Duke Roderin's recent movements and activities since his departure from the estate. What he learned only deepened his unease. The Duke, it seemed, had not continued directly along his planned route through the eastern provinces, as originally intended. Instead, he had made an unexpected detour toward the capital, where he had reportedly spent several days meeting privately with officials from the Royal Archive, the very institution responsible for maintaining official records of noble inheritances and titles throughout the kingdom. Cassian's blood ran cold upon receiving this information. There could be only one reason for such a visit, and it confirmed his worst fears entirely. The Duke was not simply curious, he was investigating. Cassian understood, with growing dread, that his carefully constructed deception was no longer as secure as he had believed. The forced marriage, he realized, needed to proceed even more quickly than originally planned. If Elira could be married and removed from the estate before the Duke's investigation gathered any further momentum, the entire matter might still be contained. He summoned Lady Miriam once more and informed her that the betrothal ceremony would need to be moved forward, from 3 weeks to just 10 days. 10 days? Miriam repeated, startled by the sudden urgency. The preparations will be rushed. What will people think? They will think nothing at all, Cassian snapped, his composure fraying slightly under the weight of his growing anxiety. We will simply explain that Lord Ashworth was eager for the arrangement and requested an earlier date. No one will question it further. Miriam did not press the matter, though the tension in her expression revealed her own growing unease at the sudden change in plans. Elira learned of the accelerated timeline the following morning, when Miriam informed her curtly that the ceremony had been moved forward significantly, leaving her with far less time than she had originally believed she had. Panic surged through her, sharp and immediate. 10 days. If Colin's cousin had not yet delivered her letter, if word had not yet reached the Duke, there might not be enough time remaining for him to intervene, even if he wished to. She found Colin later that evening, his expression grim as he confirmed her fears. My cousin left with the letter 3 days ago, he said quietly. He should reach the capital within another 2 days, assuming the roads remain clear. From there, delivering the message to the Duke's household and receiving any response could take additional time. It may not arrive quickly enough. Elira felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her with crushing force. 10 days remained until the betrothal ceremony, a ceremony that would bind her irrevocably to a man she had never met, that would strip away whatever small chance she had of reclaiming her rightful place, of ever seeing justice served for the wrongs committed against her family. She had come so close, after 10 long years of silence, to finally having a chance at something better, only to watch that chance slip further away with each passing hour. But Elira had survived 10 years of hardship through quiet, stubborn resilience, and she was not yet ready to surrender to despair. Then we will simply have to hope, she said softly, more to herself than to Colin, that 10 days is enough. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment in the stables, that Duke Roderin Ashcombe had already uncovered evidence within the Royal Archives that confirmed his worst suspicions about the Vantros inheritance, and that he was, at that very moment, making preparations of his own, preparations that would bring him back to the estate far sooner than either Alira or her uncle anticipated. The countdown had begun, though neither side of this quiet, desperate conflict yet knew exactly how little time truly remained before everything would come to a head. The Royal Archive occupied a quiet, unassuming building near the heart of the capital, its stone walls lined with centuries of records documenting every noble house, every title, every inheritance the kingdom had ever recognized. Duke Roderick Ashcombe had visited the archive many times before in his years of service, though never with quite the same sense of urgency that drove him through its doors this time. He worked closely with an elderly archivist named Master Alden Whitcomb, a man whose memory for detail rivaled the vast collection of documents he oversaw. Roderick explained only that he required information regarding the inheritance records of House Vantrose, careful not to reveal the full scope of his suspicions until he had solid evidence to support them. Master Whitcomb retrieved the relevant documents from deep within the archive's storage vaults, and together they pored over the official records late into the evening. What they found confirmed exactly what Roderick had feared. The official inheritance documents, the ones currently recognized by the Crown, clearly named Cassian Vantrose as the rightful heir to the estate and title following his brother's death, citing the absence of any surviving direct heir as the reason for the title's transfer to the next eligible male relative. There was no mention anywhere in these documents of a surviving daughter. But Master Whitcomb, drawing on his decades of experience with the archive's records, noticed something troubling about the documentation itself. "This is unusual," he murmured, examining the papers closely under the light of a nearby lamp. Inheritance documents of this nature typically require multiple witnesses and official seals from at least 2 separate magistrates, particularly in cases involving the transfer of a title from a direct line to a collateral relative. These documents bear only a single witness signature, and the seal, while appearing authentic at first glance, shows slight irregularities when compared to seals from the same magistrate's office during that same period. Roderick leaned forward, studying the documents carefully. "Irregularities? The pressure of the seal is inconsistent," Whitcomb explained, pointing to the wax impression. "Genuine seals from this particular magistrate's office typically show a deeper, more even impression, due to the specific tool he used throughout his career. This seal appears shallower, less precise. It is subtle, easy to overlook unless one has spent as many years studying such documents as I have, but I do not believe this seal is genuine." A cold certainty settled over Roderick as he absorbed this information. "You believe the document was forged?" "I believe," Whitcomb said carefully, "that this document warrants further investigation before its legitimacy can be fully confirmed. I would recommend cross-referencing it against the original magistrate's personal records, if they still exist, to determine conclusively whether this seal matches his authentic work from that period." How long would such an investigation take? Weeks, potentially, depending on how thoroughly the records were maintained. However, Whitcomb paused, his expression thoughtful. "There is a faster path, if you are willing to pursue it. The magistrate responsible for this seal, a man named Edric Halloway, is still alive, though retired from his official duties. He resides in a small township, roughly 2 days' ride from the capital. If you were to speak with him directly, he could likely confirm within moments whether this seal is authentic or not." Roderick did not hesitate. "Then I will ride there immediately." He departed the capital before dawn the following morning, pushing his horse hard along the northern road, driven by a growing sense of urgency he could not fully explain, beyond the simple, stubborn conviction that time was running short for reasons he did not yet fully understand. The journey took him just under 2 days, and he arrived at the small township exhausted but resolute, seeking out the modest cottage where the retired magistrate now lived a quiet life away from the demands of his former position. Edric Halloway was an elderly man, his hair entirely white, his hands slightly unsteady with age, though his mind remained sharp when Roderick explained the purpose of his visit and presented him with a careful copy of the seal in question, which Whitcomb had provided before his departure. Halloway studied the copy for a long moment, his brow furrowing with concentration, before shaking his head slowly. "This is not my seal," he said with quiet certainty. "The design is similar, close enough to fool a casual observer, but the details are wrong. My personal seal included a small mark, here, along the edge, representing my family's crest. This copy lacks that mark entirely. Whoever created this forgery had access to a general description of my seal, but lacked the specific knowledge required to replicate it precisely. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement confirming this? Roderick asked. One that could be presented before royal officials, if necessary. Holloway considered the request carefully, his expression growing serious. This concerns the Vantros' inheritance, does it not? I remember handling documents related to that family many years ago, though not this particular seal you have shown me. It does, Roderick confirmed. I believe the current holder of the title obtained it through fraudulent means, at the expense of the true rightful heir. Holloway's expression darkened with quiet anger. Forgery of official inheritance documents is a serious crime, Your Grace, one that carries severe consequences under royal law. If what you suspect is true, I will gladly provide whatever statement is required to see justice served properly. With Holloway's formal statement secured, carefully written and sealed with his own authentic mark for verification, Roderick began his return journey to the capital, his mind already turning toward his next steps. He would need to present this evidence to the appropriate royal officials, but he understood clearly that formal legal proceedings could take considerable time that Alira might not have if Cassian moved forward with his plans for her forced marriage. He needed to return to the estate directly, and soon, evidence in hand, to prevent whatever scheme Cassian might already be setting into motion. It was during a brief stop to rest his horse along the road back toward the capital that Roderick's personal attendant, a quiet, capable young man named Finnegan who had accompanied him throughout this entire journey, approached with an urgent message that had been passed along through a chain of couriers over the preceding days. A letter arrived for you at the capital residence, Your Grace, Finnegan explained, handing over a folded, slightly worn piece of paper. It was delivered by an unusual courier, a young man claiming to represent a messenger service operating out of the eastern provinces. He insisted it was urgent and refused to leave until someone confirmed it would reach you directly. Roderick unfolded the letter carefully, recognizing immediately the careful, cautious handwriting, though the letter bore no signature. He read Alira's brief, desperate words, and his expression hardened with grim understanding. Circumstances have changed rapidly. Time is growing short. I pray you remember your promise before it becomes too late. There was no need for further explanation. Roderick understood immediately what this meant. Cassian, sensing danger, had moved to remove Alira from the estate before the truth could be uncovered, exactly as Roderick had feared he might. How long ago was this letter sent? He asked Finnegan urgently. The courier estimated it had been traveling for approximately 5 days by the time it reached the capital residence, Your Grace, accounting for the time required to reach him from wherever it originated. 5 days, combined with the additional time required for Roderick's own journey back toward the estate. That meant a significant portion of whatever timeline Cassian had established for Alira's marriage had likely already passed. We ride immediately, Roderick said, already moving toward his horse. No further delays. He pushed his horse and his small group of attendants harder than he had in years, driven by an urgency that went beyond simple duty or obligation. Somewhere along that long, grueling ride back toward the Vantros estate, Roderick found himself confronting a realization he had not fully allowed himself to acknowledge until that moment. His determination to help Alira reclaim her rightful inheritance had begun, certainly, as a matter of honor, a debt owed to her father's memory. But somewhere in the days since their brief conversation in that quiet drawing room, something had shifted within him, something he had not expected, and was not entirely certain how to define. He thought of her quiet dignity, despite 10 years of cruelty and hardship, the careful strength in her voice, as she had spoken of her circumstances, without ever once descending into self-pity, the flash of cautious, fragile hope in her eyes, when he had spoken her true name aloud, for the first time in a decade. He was not a man given to sentiment, particularly not after years spent on battlefields where such feelings often proved dangerous distractions, but he could not deny, as his horse thundered along the eastern road under a darkening sky, that his urgency to reach the estate in time was driven by more than simple obligation. He would not allow Alira Vantros to be forced into a marriage that would strip away whatever chance remained for her to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Whatever it cost him, he intended to make certain of that. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Alira counted the remaining days with growing dread. watching the preparations for her betrothal ceremony accelerate around her with sickening speed. Seamstresses arrived to fit her for a formal gown she had no desire to wear. Invitations were sent to various minor nobles throughout the region, ensuring the ceremony would be properly witnessed and documented. Lord Bartholomew Ashworth himself sent word that he would arrive 3 days before the ceremony to formally meet his intended bride for the first time. Elira had received no response to her desperate letter, and with each passing day, her hope dimmed further, replaced by a grim, resigned understanding that she might indeed be forced through this ceremony, regardless of whatever the Duke had promised her. She continued her duties mechanically, her mind numb with dread, counting down the days until Lord Ashworth's arrival, until the ceremony that would seal her fate irrevocably. 5 days remained until the betrothal ceremony, when Lord Bartholomew Ashworth's carriage finally rolled up the long drive toward the Vantros estate, and Elira, standing at her window watching its approach, felt something cold and final settle over her heart. She did not yet know that Duke Roderin Ashcombe, evidence in hand, was riding through the night at that very moment, closing the distance between them with every passing hour, determined to arrive before it was too late. But hope, fragile and uncertain as it was, remained a dangerous thing to hold on to, and Elira, watching Lord Ashworth step down from his carriage below, could not yet bring herself to believe that rescue would truly arrive in time. She could only wait, and hope, and pray silently that 5 days would prove to be enough. Lord Bartholomew Ashworth was not a cruel man by nature, though he possessed neither the sharpness of mind nor the sensitivity of character to notice the quiet desperation in the eyes of the young woman he had traveled so far to meet. He was, at 40 years of age, a heavy-set man with a fondness for fine food and idle conversation, more interested in the financial arrangements Cassian had promised him than in the personal qualities of his intended bride. He greeted Elira with polite, if distracted, courtesy during their first formal meeting in the manor's drawing room, remarking briefly on her appearance before turning his attention almost entirely to Cassian, discussing matters of dowry and property with far more enthusiasm than he had shown toward Elira herself. Elira sat through the meeting in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, saying only what was required of her, offering no genuine warmth or interest because she felt none. She studied Lord Ashworth carefully, searching for some sign of decency she might cling to, some indication that her future, however unwanted, might at least be tolerable. She found little to reassure her. He spoke of her, when he spoke of her at all, as though she were a piece of property being transferred between owners, a transaction to be finalized rather than a person to be understood. When the meeting concluded, Elira retreated to her small room, her chest tight, with a suffocating sense of helplessness. 4 days remained until the betrothal ceremony. She had received no word from Roderin, no indication that her letter had ever reached him, no sign that the promise he had made her weeks ago carried any weight at all beyond the polite words of a man eager to be rid of an inconvenient conversation. She began to wonder, in her darkest moments, whether she had been foolish to place her hope in a stranger's promise, whether the flash of recognition and concern she had seen in his eyes had meant anything at all, or whether she had simply imagined significance where none truly existed. Colin found her that evening in the stables, her eyes red from silent tears she had tried and failed to hide. "Still no word?" he asked gently, settling beside her. She shook her head. 4 days remain. I do not think he is coming, Colin. I think perhaps I was foolish to believe otherwise. Colin was quiet for a long moment before speaking. My cousin confirmed the letter reached the capital safely. Whether the Duke received it in time to act, I cannot say. But Elira, you have survived 10 years of far worse than this uncertainty. Do not surrender hope entirely, not yet. Elira wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to hold on to whatever fragile hope remained, but exhaustion and fear had worn her resilience thin, and she found it increasingly difficult to summon the strength required to keep believing that rescue might still arrive. The following days passed in a blur of dreaded preparation. The seamstresses completed her betrothal gown, an elaborate garment of pale blue silk that felt heavy and foreign against her skin, so different from the simple gray uniform she had worn for 10 years that it seemed to belong to an entirely different person. Guests began arriving from neighboring estates, minor nobles eager to witness the union and curry favor with both families involved. The manor buzzed with activity, servants rushing to prepare guest chambers, kitchens working overtime to prepare an elaborate feast for the occasion. Illyra moved through it all like a ghost, numb and resigned, her earlier hope having faded into a kind of hollow acceptance. She told herself she would survive this, as she had survived everything else. She told herself that perhaps, in time, she might find some small measure of tolerable life within Lord Ashworth's household, far from the daily reminders of everything that had been stolen from her. But some quiet, stubborn part of her, buried deep beneath the exhaustion and fear, refused entirely to let go of the memory of Roderin's steady gray eyes, his quiet promise spoken with such genuine conviction that she had believed, however briefly, that someone in this world finally saw her worth. The morning of the betrothal ceremony arrived with clear skies and unwelcome brightness, as though the world itself had failed to notice the quiet tragedy unfolding within the Vantrose estate's walls. Illyra was dressed in her pale blue gown by two maids assigned specifically for the occasion, her hair arranged elaborately atop her head, small blue flowers woven through the careful braids. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the polished, elegant young woman staring back at her, so different from the exhausted servant girl she had been for 10 long years. She thought, with bitter irony, that this was the first time in a decade anyone had bothered to make her look presentable, and it was happening only because she was being handed off to a man she barely knew, a transaction disguised as a celebration. The ceremony was to take place in the manor's grand hall, the same hall where she had served countless dinners as an invisible servant, now transformed with elaborate decorations, ribbons and flowers, arranged along every surface. Guests filled the rows of chairs arranged before a raised platform, where Lord Ashworth would formally declare his intention to marry her, where Cassian would offer his blessing as her supposed guardian, where the entire fiction of her identity would be sealed further into permanence before an audience of witnesses. Illyra stood in a small antechamber adjacent to the hall, waiting for the ceremony to begin, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and numb resignation. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of gathered guests, the occasional burst of polite laughter, the sound of a small ensemble of musicians tuning their instruments for the occasion. Lady Miriam entered the antechamber briefly, examining Illyra's appearance with a critical eye. "You look presentable enough," she said, her tone carrying no particular warmth. "Try to smile during the ceremony. It will make for a more convincing display." Illyra said nothing, and Miriam, apparently satisfied that no further instruction was necessary, departed to take her seat among the gathered guests. Alone in the antechamber, Illyra closed her eyes and took a slow, steadying breath, gathering whatever strength remained within her to face what was about to happen. The door opened, and Cassian entered, dressed in his finest formal attire, his expression carrying the satisfied confidence of a man who believed his troubles were about to be permanently resolved. "It is time," he said simply, extending his arm to escort her into the hall, a final, cruel performance of familial care, before an audience that would never know the truth of their relationship. Illyra took his offered arm, her expression carefully neutral, and allowed herself to be led toward the grand hall's entrance. The moment the doors opened before her, revealing the full assembly of gathered guests, the raised platform where Lord Ashworth already stood waiting, with an expression of pleased anticipation, Illyra felt the last of her resolve threaten to crumble entirely. She took a slow step forward, then another, moving down the aisle between rows of unfamiliar faces, all of them watching her with polite, curious interest. None of them aware of the desperate hope she had clung to in her final days. None of them aware that the woman walking toward this ceremony was the true, rightful heir to the very estate hosting this elaborate display. She was perhaps halfway down the aisle when the sound of urgent commotion erupted from somewhere near the manor's front entrance, distant but unmistakable. Voices raised sharply in alarm, the heavy sound of hurried footsteps approaching rapidly. The gathered guests began to murmur uncertainly, heads turning toward the source of the disturbance. Cassian's grip on Illyra's arm tightened noticeably, his expression flickering with sudden, sharp unease. The doors at the rear of the grand hall burst open with force, and a manor servant stumbled inside, breathless and clearly alarmed, his voice carrying urgently across the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. "Duke Roderick Ashcombe has arrived," he announced, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "He demands immediate entry, and he will not be turned away." Elira's heart stopped entirely, for one suspended moment, before slamming forward with sudden, desperate hope. Cassian's face drained of color, his composed mask cracking visibly for the first time before the assembled guests. "This is highly irregular," he managed, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We are in the middle of a private family ceremony. Surely this can wait until—" His words were cut short as the Grand Hall's main entrance doors were thrown open with deliberate force, and Duke Roderick Ashcombe strode inside, still dressed in the dust and travel-worn clothing of a man who had ridden hard and without pause across considerable distance, his expression carrying the controlled, dangerous intensity of a commander who had arrived on a battlefield precisely when needed. Behind him followed two of his personal attendants, one of them carrying a leather satchel that Elira did not yet recognize, but that Cassian's eyes fixed upon immediately with visible dread. The entire hall fell into stunned, uncertain silence as Roderick walked steadily down the center aisle, his gaze fixed not on Cassian, not on Lord Ashworth standing bewildered upon the platform, but directly on Elira herself, standing frozen halfway toward a marriage she had never wanted, wearing a gown that felt suddenly like a costume in a play she had never agreed to perform. He stopped before her, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion evident in his features, the evidence of days spent riding without proper rest. All of it undertaken, she realized with overwhelming emotion, for her sake. "I apologize for the interruption," Roderick said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, addressing the room at large though his eyes remained fixed on Elira. "But I could not, in good conscience, allow this ceremony to proceed any further." Murmurs of confusion rippled through the gathered guests. Lord Ashworth, still standing awkwardly upon the platform, looked between Roderick and Cassian with growing bewilderment, clearly uncertain what was happening, or why a Duke of Roderick's standing had chosen to intervene so dramatically in what should have been a private family matter. Cassian, recovering some measure of his composure, stepped forward with forced calm. "Your Grace, I must insist, this is a private ceremony. Whatever business you believe you have here can surely wait until—" "It cannot wait," Roderick interrupted, his tone sharp and final, brooking no further argument. "Because this ceremony, as it currently stands, is built upon a lie that has persisted for 10 years, and I will not allow it to continue a moment longer." The hall fell into absolute, breathless silence. Roderick turned slowly, deliberately, to face the assembled crowd of guests, his commanding presence filling the space with an authority that not even Cassian could easily challenge. "10 years ago," he began, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "Lord Alden Vantros and Lady Serena Vantros died under circumstances that were, at the time, accepted without question. Their estate and title passed to Lord Alden's younger brother, Cassian Vantros, on the understanding that no direct heir had survived to claim it." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room, before continuing. "That understanding was false." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cassian's face had gone entirely pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, though he remained frozen, apparently unable to summon any response to counter what was unfolding before him. Roderick turned back toward Elira, and slowly, deliberately, in front of every single person gathered within that grand hall, he lowered himself down onto one knee before her. The entire room erupted into stunned murmurs and gasps, though Roderick remained entirely focused on Elira, his pale gray eyes steady and unwavering, carrying none of the calculated composure he had shown during their earlier meetings, replaced instead by something raw and unguarded, and entirely genuine. "Elira Vantros," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the hall. "Daughter of Lord Alden Vantros and Lady Serena Vantros, rightful heir to this estate and title. I kneel before you not as a suitor, but as a soldier who owes an unpaid debt to your father, a man who once saved my life at great personal cost, and who deserved far better than to have his daughter spend a single day of her life treated as anything less than what she truly is." Elira stood frozen, tears streaming freely down her face now, unable to fully process the overwhelming rush of emotion crashing through her all at once. 10 years of silence, of invisibility, of buried grief and stolen identity, all of it collapsing in this single, impossible moment, witnessed by an entire hall of strangers who had gathered expecting a very different ceremony entirely. Cassian's voice, when it finally emerged, was thin and desperate. "This is preposterous. Lies, fabricated entirely, to disrupt a legitimate ceremony. I have no idea what this girl has told you, Your Grace, but I assure you, I did not learn this from her alone," Rodarin said, rising slowly to his feet, his gaze shifting toward Cassian, with cold, controlled fury. "I have spent the past several weeks investigating this matter thoroughly, and I have gathered evidence, substantial and irrefutable, proving that the inheritance documents you presented to the crown 10 years ago were forged." He gestured toward his attendant, who stepped forward and handed him the leather satchel he had been carrying. Rodarin opened it slowly, deliberately, and withdrew several documents, holding them aloft for the assembled crowd to see. A formal statement from Magistrate Edric Halloway, confirming that the seal used to authenticate these inheritance documents was not his own, but a forgery, Rodarin announced, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence. Combined with testimony already gathered by royal officials at the archive, this evidence establishes clearly and conclusively that Cassian Vantros obtained his title through fraudulent means, at the direct expense of his own niece. The hall erupted into chaos, guests turning to one another in shocked disbelief, whispers rising quickly into an overwhelming wave of noise. Cassian stood frozen at the center of it all, his carefully constructed decade of lies collapsing entirely around him in a single devastating moment, while Lord Ashworth, still standing awkwardly upon the abandoned platform, quietly began edging his way toward the hall's exit, clearly eager to distance himself from whatever scandal was unfolding before him. Elira, standing amid the chaos, felt Rodarin's steady presence beside her, and for the first time in 10 long years, she allowed herself to fully believe that everything was, finally, about to change. The chaos in the grand hall did not settle quickly. Guests rose from their seats in confusion, some demanding explanations, others already whispering excitedly among themselves about the scandal that would surely dominate conversation across the eastern provinces for months to come. Lord Ashworth had by now fully retreated toward the exit, muttering something about urgent business requiring his immediate departure, clearly wanting no further association with a family whose fraudulent dealings had just been exposed before an entire assembly of witnesses. Cassian, cornered and desperate, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "This is an outrage," he declared, his voice rising sharply as he turned to address the gathered crowd directly. "A duke, however respected, cannot simply appear uninvited and level baseless accusations against a peer of the realm. I demand proper proceedings, proper investigation, before any of you accept these wild claims as truth." "You will have your proper proceedings," Rodarin replied evenly, his composure unshaken by Cassian's outburst. "I have already notified royal officials of this matter, and formal investigators are en route to this estate as we speak. They will examine the evidence I have gathered, along with whatever records remain within your own possession, and they will determine the truth of this matter through official channels, exactly as the law requires." Cassian's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little color remained. "You have already notified the crown?" "I have," Rodarin confirmed. "Before I departed the capital, I ensured that Magistrate Halloway's statement, along with the archive's own findings regarding the irregularities in your inheritance documents, were formally submitted to the royal court. This is no longer simply a private matter between our two households, Lord Vantros. It is now, quite officially, a matter for the crown to resolve." The color drained further from Cassian's face as the full weight of his situation settled over him. He glanced toward Lady Miriam, seated among the stunned guests, her own expression a mixture of horror and rising panic, before turning back toward Rodarin, with an expression that had shifted from defiance into something closer to desperate calculation. "Surely," Cassian said, his voice dropping lower, attempting a more conciliatory tone, "this matter can be resolved privately, between families, without the need for such drastic public exposure. I am certain we could reach some arrangement that would satisfy all parties involved." "There will be no private arrangement," Rodarin said firmly. "You have stolen 10 years of this young woman's life, forced her into servitude within her own family's home, and attempted to further remove her from any possibility of reclaiming her rightful inheritance through a hastily arranged marriage. Justice will be served through proper legal channels, exactly as it should be. Illyra, standing quietly beside Rodarin throughout this exchange, felt a strange, overwhelming mixture of emotions churning within her. Relief, certainly, and a fierce, unfamiliar sense of vindication after 10 years of enforced silence, but also a lingering disbelief, as though she remained uncertain whether this moment was truly real, or simply another elaborate dream she might wake from at any moment. Back in her narrow servant's bed, facing another endless day of invisible labor. The sound of approaching horses outside the manor drew everyone's attention. Within minutes, a group of royal officials, dressed in the formal blue and silver colors of the Crown's judicial service, entered the Grand Hall. Their leader, a stern-faced official, named Magistrate Corwin Halden, surveying the chaotic scene with practiced calm. "I understand there are serious allegations regarding fraudulent inheritance documents connected to this household," Magistrate Halden announced, his voice carrying authority that immediately settled some of the lingering chaos among the gathered guests. "Duke Rodarin Ashcombe, I understand you have evidence to present?" "I do," Rodarin confirmed, stepping forward with the leather satchel still in hand, along with a witness prepared to testify to the authenticity of my findings, should the Crown require it. Magistrate Halden nodded briskly. "Then I must ask that everyone present remain within the manor, for the time being, while my officials conduct a preliminary review of the evidence and take statements from relevant parties. Lord Cassian Vantros, I must also inform you that until this matter is fully resolved, your authority over this estate and its associated title is to be considered suspended, pending the outcome of our investigation." Cassian's composure finally shattered entirely. "You cannot simply strip me of my title based on unverified accusations," he protested, though the desperation in his voice had grown unmistakable. "I can, and I will," Magistrate Halden replied firmly, "given the seriousness of the evidence already presented. Should your innocence be established through proper investigation, your authority will of course be restored. But until that determination is made, the estate will remain under royal oversight." The gathered guests watched this exchange with rapt, uncomfortable fascination, many of them already anticipating the scandal that would ripple through noble circles across the entire eastern region once word of this event spread, as it inevitably would. Over the following hours, royal officials moved methodically through the manor, gathering documents from Cassian's study, taking statements from household staff, carefully cataloging the evidence that would ultimately determine the truth of the matter. Illyra was asked to provide her own account of the past 10 years, a request that filled her with quiet apprehension, though Rodarin remained close beside her throughout the process, a steady, reassuring presence that helped her find the courage to speak openly, for the first time in a decade, about everything she had endured. She spoke of her parents' deaths, of Cassian's sudden arrival and the immediate stripping away of her identity, of 10 years spent scrubbing floors and serving meals in a house that had once been her childhood home. She spoke of Bennett, the old steward who had questioned Cassian's authority and disappeared within days, his fate never explained to her. She spoke of the ring hidden beneath her sleeve, the last physical connection to the family she had lost. Magistrate Halden listened to her account with careful, professional attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his expression growing increasingly grave as the full scope of Cassian's deception became clear. "This ring," he said eventually, gesturing toward her wrist. "May I examine it?" Illyra hesitated only briefly before extending her arm, allowing the magistrate to carefully untie the cord and examine the small golden ring bearing the crest of hawk and flame. "This matches the description of the Vantros family seal recorded in the royal archive," Halden confirmed, turning the ring carefully in the light. "A ring of this design, passed exclusively to the firstborn heir of the direct bloodline, would serve as compelling physical evidence supporting your claim, particularly when combined with the documentation Duke Ashcombe has already provided." Illyra felt a small, cautious flicker of hope settle more firmly within her chest, no longer quite so fragile as it had been in the days before Rodarin's dramatic return. As evening fell over the estate, Magistrate Halden gathered the household staff, along with the remaining guests who had not yet departed in the wake of the scandal, to announce his preliminary findings. Based on the evidence gathered today, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the manor's grand entrance hall, including formal testimony regarding the forged inheritance documents, physical evidence corroborating Alira Vantros's claim to the direct bloodline, and numerous witness statements confirming the pattern of mistreatment she endured over the past decade. I am recommending that this matter proceed to a formal royal tribunal, to be held within the capital within the next fortnight. Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd once more, though the tone had shifted noticeably from earlier confusion into something closer to cautious anticipation. Many of the assembled nobles already beginning to reconsider their previous impressions of the quiet, unremarkable servant girl they had learned tonight was, in truth, the rightful heir to House Vantros. In the meantime, Halden continued, Lord Cassian Vantros will remain under supervised residence within this estate, though stripped of any authority over its management or resources, pending the tribunal's final determination. Miss Alira Vantros, given the substantial evidence already presented, will be granted provisional recognition as the estate's rightful heir during this interim period, under the protection and oversight of the Crown's appointed representatives. Alira, standing quietly beside Rodarin as this announcement settled over the room, felt tears once again threatening to spill down her cheeks, though this time, they carried an entirely different weight than the despair she had grown accustomed to over the past decade. For the first time in 10 years, she had been given, however provisionally, however cautiously, official recognition of who she truly was. The gathered crowd began to disperse slowly over the following hour, many of the guests offering awkward, hesitant congratulations to Alira as they departed, uncertain exactly how to address a woman whose status had shifted so dramatically within the span of a single evening. Cassian was escorted, under quiet but firm supervision, to a private chamber within the manor, his expression hollow and defeated, the decade of carefully constructed lies he had built now lying in ruins around him. Lady Miriam followed shortly after, her earlier cold composure entirely gone, replaced by visible panic, as she began to fully grasp the consequences that likely awaited her own future, given her clear complicity in her husband's decade-long deception. As the manor slowly emptied of its guests, and the chaos of the evening began to settle into quiet, exhausted stillness, Alira found herself standing alone with Rodarin, near the entrance to the grand hall, the very room where she had served countless invisible meals over the past 10 years, now transformed by the events of this single, extraordinary evening. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice still unsteady with the overwhelming weight of everything that had happened. "I did not truly believe you would return in time. I gave you my word," Rodarin replied simply, his pale gray eyes soft in a way she had not seen before. "I do not make promises lightly, Alira, and I do not break them." She studied him for a long moment, searching for words adequate to express the depth of gratitude and disbelief still churning within her, but finding none that felt sufficient. "What happens now?" she asked instead. "Now," Rodarin said, "you rest. Tomorrow, we begin preparing for the tribunal. There is still much work to be done before your position is fully secured, but tonight, at least, you may finally sleep without fear of tomorrow's ceremony hanging over you." Alira nodded slowly, exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with her after the overwhelming events of the day. As she turned to make her way toward her small servant's room, the only home she had truly known for the past decade, Rodarin's voice stopped her gently. "Alira," he said, "you need not return to that room any longer. As provisional heir to this estate, you are entitled to proper quarters befitting your true status, effective immediately." The realization struck her with unexpected force, another small, significant marker of just how dramatically her circumstances had shifted within the span of a single day. For the first time in 10 years, she would not be sleeping in a narrow servant's bed, would not be waking before dawn to scrub floors and serve meals to a family that had stolen everything from her. She allowed herself, finally, standing alone with Rodarin in the quiet aftermath of the evening's chaos, to feel something she had not permitted herself to feel in 10 long years. Genuine, unguarded hope for whatever future now lay ahead of her. The 2 weeks leading up to the royal tribunal passed in a strange, disorienting blur for Alira, each day bringing some new adjustment to a life she had almost forgotten was possible. She was given proper quarters within the manor, a spacious room overlooking the eastern gardens that had once belonged to a visiting relative, years before her parents' deaths, furnished simply but comfortably, worlds apart from the narrow, sparse room she had occupied for the past decade. She struggled, at first, with the strangeness of her new circumstances. She found herself waking before dawn out of ingrained habit, momentarily confused before remembering that she was no longer expected in the kitchens before sunrise. She caught herself, more than once, moving to clear dishes or straighten linens before catching herself and remembering that such tasks were no longer hers to perform. Marta, the old cook who had shown her small kindnesses over the years, was among the first to seek her out during this transitional period. Finding Alira alone in the garden one afternoon, staring out at the horizon, with an expression of quiet, uncertain contemplation. "You look as though you're carrying the weight of the entire kingdom on your shoulders," Marta observed, settling onto the bench beside her, with the easy familiarity of someone who had known her through the hardest years of her life. "I do not entirely know how to exist like this," Alira admitted quietly. "For 10 years, I have known exactly what was expected of me each day. Now, I find myself uncertain of even the smallest things." Marta patted her hand gently. "That uncertainty will fade with time, child. You have spent a decade surviving circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. Learning to simply live, rather than merely survive, is its own kind of challenge, but you will find your footing." Alira appreciated the old cook's steady presence during those uncertain weeks, along with Colin's continued friendship, both of them representing a connection to the only version of stability she had known throughout her difficult years within the household. Meanwhile, preparations for the royal tribunal continued in earnest. Roderin remained at the estate throughout much of this period, working closely with the royal investigators who had taken up temporary residence to conduct their thorough examination of Cassian's affairs. Alira found herself drawn increasingly into his steady, reassuring presence during this time, their conversations extending beyond the practical matters of the impending tribunal, into quieter, more personal territory. She learned more of his own history during these conversations, of his early years as a young officer under her father's command, of the battles he had fought and the losses he had endured throughout his years of service to the crown. He spoke of these experiences with a quiet, measured honesty that Alira found she deeply appreciated, given how little honesty had existed within her own life over the past decade. In turn, she found herself opening up to him in ways she had not anticipated, sharing memories of her early childhood before her parents' deaths, fragments of warmth and happiness she had nearly forgotten existed beneath the weight of 10 years of hardship. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the household staff, many of whom exchanged quiet, knowing glances whenever the Duke and the newly recognized heir were seen together, though neither Alira nor Roderin acknowledged openly whatever was developing between them, both too consumed by the pressing matters of the impending tribunal to fully examine their own feelings. The investigation into Cassian's affairs, meanwhile, continued to uncover increasingly damning evidence. Royal investigators, working methodically through the estate's financial records and correspondence, discovered additional inconsistencies beyond the forged inheritance documents Roderin had already presented. They found evidence of falsified financial reports submitted to the Crown over the years, understating the estate's true income to reduce the taxes owed, along with correspondence suggesting Cassian had bribed at least one local official to ensure his fraudulent claim to the title went unchallenged in the years immediately following his brother's death. Most disturbing of all, investigators uncovered records suggesting that the accident, which had claimed the lives of Alira's parents, may not have been an accident at all. Magistrate Halden summoned both Alira and Roderin to a private meeting to discuss this troubling discovery, his expression grave as he laid out the evidence his investigators had gathered. "We located records of a payment made by Lord Cassian Vantros to an individual named Garrick Thorne, dated just 3 days before your parents' fatal carriage accident," Halden explained, sliding a copied ledger across the table for Alira and Roderin to examine. Thorne was known, at the time, to work occasionally as a hired hand for various disreputable purposes throughout the region. He has since disappeared entirely, with no trace of his current whereabouts. Alira felt a cold, sickening weight settle over her chest as the implications of this discovery sank in. "You believe my uncle arranged for my parents' deaths?" "I believe," Halden said carefully, "that the evidence strongly suggests this possibility. Though without Thorne's testimony, or further corroborating evidence, we cannot yet establish this conclusively enough to bring formal charges of that specific nature. However, combined with the substantial evidence of financial fraud and document forgery already gathered, this discovery further strengthens the case against Lord Cassian regarding the illegitimate nature of his claim to the Vantros title. Illyra sat in stunned, heavy silence, processing this devastating revelation. She had long suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind, that something about her parents' deaths had never fully added up, echoing the concerns old Bennett had raised all those years ago. Concerns that had led to his own sudden, unexplained disappearance from the household. "Bennett," she said suddenly, looking up sharply, "the steward who questioned my uncle's authority immediately following my parents' deaths. He disappeared within days of raising his objections. Has anyone investigated what became of him?" Halden made a note of this information with visible interest. "We were not previously aware of this individual. I will have my investigators look into his disappearance immediately. It is possible he may still be alive, and if so, his testimony could prove invaluable to this case." Over the following days, royal investigators traced Bennett's movements, following his abrupt departure from the estate, eventually locating him living a quiet, modest life in a small coastal village several days' journey from the Vantros estate. He had, it turned out, been given a substantial sum of money by Cassian at the time of his departure, along with an unmistakable threat regarding the consequences should he ever speak publicly about his suspicions. When royal investigators located him and explained the ongoing tribunal against Cassian, Bennett agreed immediately to provide formal testimony, expressing quiet relief that the truth he had long suspected but never dared voice was finally coming to light. "I always believed something was wrong about that accident," Bennett explained during his formal statement, which was recorded and prepared for presentation before the tribunal. "The horses on that road had traveled it countless times without incident. The storm that night, while significant, was not severe enough to explain such a catastrophic loss of control. When Lord Cassian arrived within days, papers already prepared, I knew something was deeply wrong, though I lacked any proof at the time to challenge him directly." Illyra, upon learning of Bennett's testimony, felt a complicated mixture of grief and vindication. The confirmation, even without absolute proof, that her parents' deaths may have been deliberately orchestrated by her own uncle, filled her with a fresh wave of sorrow for the family she had lost, layered now with a burning need to see justice properly served. As the date of the tribunal approached, the evidence against Cassian continued mounting steadily. Beyond the forged documents and financial fraud, beyond the troubling circumstances surrounding her parents' deaths, numerous household staff members, past and present, came forward to offer testimony regarding the decade of mistreatment Illyra had endured, painting a clear, damning picture of systematic cruelty carried out under Cassian's direct authority. Percival and Clarissa, Cassian's own children, found themselves increasingly isolated as the scandal deepened, many of their previous social connections quietly distancing themselves from the family in anticipation of the tribunal's likely outcome. Clarissa, in particular, approached Illyra privately during this period, her earlier cruelty replaced by nervous, calculated attempts at reconciliation. "Surely you understand," Clarissa said during one such uncomfortable encounter, "that whatever happened, it was my father's doing, not mine. I was merely a child when all of this began. You cannot blame me for circumstances I had no control over." Illyra studied her former tormentor carefully, remembering countless small cruelties inflicted over the years, deliberate humiliations dealt out with casual, practiced ease. "I do not blame you for circumstances beyond your control," she said evenly. "But I remember clearly the choices you made, once you were old enough to understand exactly what those circumstances were." Clarissa's expression flickered with something between shame and lingering defiance, though she said nothing further, retreating quickly from the conversation. Finally, after 2 weeks of intensive investigation and preparation, the day of the formal royal tribunal arrived. Illyra, Roderin, and the full weight of evidence gathered against Cassian traveled together to the capital, where the tribunal would be held before a panel of royal judges, with numerous witnesses prepared to testify regarding the truth that had remained buried for 10 long years. Illyra stood before the grand chamber of the royal court, dressed not in the borrowed finery of a forced betrothal ceremony, but in clothing that reflected, for the first time in a decade, her true status and dignity. Beside her stood Roderick, steady and resolute, along with Bennett, Marta, and several other witnesses prepared to speak on her behalf. Across the chamber, Cassian sat with his lawyer, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, defeated expression of a man who understood, finally, that the decade of lies he had built his life upon was about to collapse entirely before the full weight of royal justice. As the tribunal formally began, Elira felt a quiet, steady strength settle over her, born not of arrogance or vengeance, but of 10 years of quiet endurance finally reaching its long-overdue reckoning. The truth, buried for a decade beneath layers of deception and cruelty, was finally about to be revealed in full, before the entire kingdom. The royal tribunal chamber was an imposing space, its high stone walls lined with tall windows that let in streams of pale morning light, illuminating rows of wooden benches filled with observers who had gathered to witness what had already become one of the most talked-about scandals in recent memory. Word of the dramatic betrothal interruption had spread quickly through the capital's noble circles, and curiosity had drawn a substantial crowd eager to witness the tribunal's proceedings firsthand. 3 royal judges presided over the chamber, seated upon a raised platform at its center, with Magistrate Halden serving as the presiding official responsible for guiding the proceedings and presenting the evidence gathered over the preceding weeks. Elira sat quietly beside Roderick near the front of the chamber, her hands folded carefully in her lap, doing her best to maintain outward composure despite the nervous energy churning within her. Across the aisle, Cassian sat beside his lawyer, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled, though visibly strained under the weight of what was about to unfold. The proceedings began with Magistrate Halden presenting a formal summary of the case, outlining the initial evidence that had prompted the investigation, the forged inheritance documents, the irregular seal identified by the retired magistrate Edric Halloway, and the subsequent discoveries made throughout the following weeks. "We call Magistrate Edric Halloway to provide formal testimony," Halden announced, and the elderly magistrate, who had traveled to the capital specifically for this occasion, rose from his seat among the witnesses and made his way carefully to the stand positioned before the judges. Halloway's testimony was clear and methodical, explaining in careful detail the specific irregularities he had identified within the forged seal, comparing it directly against authentic samples from his own personal records, which he had brought with him for the judge's examination. His expertise, built over decades of service as a magistrate, lent significant weight to his conclusions, and the judges listened with evident, careful attention throughout his testimony. When Cassian's lawyer attempted to challenge Halloway's findings during cross-examination, suggesting that perhaps the discrepancies could be attributed to simple wear or degradation over time, rather than deliberate forgery, Halloway responded with calm, confident precision. "I have examined thousands of seals over the course of my career," he stated firmly. "I know the difference between natural wear and deliberate forgery. This seal was created by someone attempting to replicate my mark without access to the original tool, and the absence of my family crest along its edge is not a matter of degradation, but a fundamental flaw in the forger's knowledge of my authentic design." The lawyer, finding little traction in this line of questioning, retreated, allowing Halloway to step down from the stand. Next, Bennett was called to provide his testimony regarding the immediate aftermath of Elira's parents' deaths, his account of Cassian's suspiciously rapid arrival with prepared documents, and his own subsequent forced departure from the household after raising questions about the circumstances surrounding the accident. "I served House Vantros faithfully for 30 years, Bennett stated, his voice steady despite his advanced age. "I knew that road well, knew those horses well, and I knew, without doubt, that something about that night's events did not align with what I was told had happened. When I voiced these concerns, I was paid a considerable sum and warned, quite clearly, that continuing to raise such questions would not be tolerated." Cassian's lawyer attempted a similar challenge to Bennett's testimony as he had with Halloway's, suggesting that an elderly servant's recollections from a decade prior could hardly be considered reliable evidence. But Bennett, unshaken, calmly reiterated the specific details of his concerns, details that aligned precisely with the financial records investigators had subsequently uncovered, documenting Cassian's suspicious payment to the mysterious individual named Garrick Thorne. The presentation of this financial evidence, showing the payment made just 3 days before the fatal accident, sent a visible ripple of shock through the gathered observers in the chamber. Cassian's composure finally cracked visibly, his face draining of color, as the judges examined the ledger entries with grim, careful attention. This payment could have been for any number of legitimate purposes, Cassian's lawyer argued. Though even his own voice carried an unmistakable note of strain, there is no direct evidence connecting this payment to the accident itself. That may be true, Magistrate Halden acknowledged evenly, and for that reason, this tribunal does not formally charge Lord Cassian Vantros with responsibility for his brother's death, absent more conclusive evidence. However, the timing of this payment, combined with the subsequent forgery of inheritance documents and the systematic mistreatment of the rightful heir over the following decade, paints an unmistakable picture of deliberate, calculated fraud carried out for personal gain. The testimony continued throughout the day, with numerous household staff members, both past and present, coming forward to describe the treatment Elira had endured over the preceding decade. Marta spoke of the small kindnesses she had tried to offer amid an otherwise harsh environment. Colin spoke of teaching Elira to read in secret, of her quiet resilience despite years of hardship. Even several servants who had joined the household more recently, unaware, until the scandal broke of Elira's true identity, offered accounts of the clear favoritism shown toward Cassian's own children, compared to the harsh treatment consistently directed toward Elira. Finally, Elira herself was called to provide her own testimony, and she rose from her seat, her legs slightly unsteady beneath her, and made her way to the stand positioned before the 3 judges. She spoke slowly at first, her voice quiet but steadily gaining strength as she recounted the years of her childhood, fragments of warmth and happiness before her parents' deaths, followed by the abrupt, jarring transition into servitude that had defined the following decade of her life. She spoke of scrubbing floors before dawn, of standing silently against walls while her cousins dined at tables that should rightfully have included her, of being denied her own name in front of guests, forced instead to answer to nothing more than girl or the orphan. She spoke, too, of the small ring she had kept hidden for 10 years, her mother's final words to her the night before the accident, words she had not fully understood until circumstances had finally allowed their meaning to become clear. Throughout her testimony, the chamber remained utterly silent, the weight of her quiet, dignified account settling heavily over every observer present. Even Cassian's lawyer, when the time came for cross-examination, seemed reluctant to challenge her testimony too aggressively, perhaps sensing the shift in sentiment that had settled over the room as her story unfolded. When Elira finally stepped down from the stand, her testimony complete, she felt an overwhelming sense of release, as though 10 years of carefully buried grief and silence had finally found their proper voice, spoken aloud before witnesses who could no longer deny or dismiss the truth of what she had endured. The tribunal continued for a second full day, with additional evidence presented regarding the falsified financial reports Cassian had submitted to the Crown over the years, along with testimony from the local official who had accepted bribes to overlook irregularities in the estate's tax records. By the time the presentation of evidence concluded, the case against Cassian had grown overwhelming in its scope and severity. The 3 judges retired to deliberate, leaving the chamber in tense, anticipatory silence, as observers speculated quietly among themselves about the likely outcome. When the judges returned several hours later, the chamber fell into immediate, expectant silence. The lead judge, an elderly woman named Justice Ordelia Marsh, rose to deliver the tribunal's formal ruling, her voice carrying clearly and firmly across the silent chamber. Having thoroughly examined the evidence presented before this tribunal, she began, "This panel finds Lord Cassian Vantros guilty of deliberate fraud regarding the falsification of inheritance documents, guilty of systematic financial deception in his reporting to the Crown, and guilty of the sustained, deliberate mistreatment of Elira Vantros, the rightful and legitimate heir to House Vantros's title and estate." A wave of murmurs swept through the gathered crowd, though Justice Marsh continued, her voice unwavering. Regarding the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Lord Alden Vantros and Lady Serena Vantros, this tribunal finds the evidence presented, while deeply troubling, insufficient to establish conclusive proof of direct responsibility on the part of Lord Cassian Vantros. However, Given the clear pattern of fraudulent behavior established through this proceeding, this tribunal recommends that further investigation into this matter continue under separate proceedings, with the Crown's full resources dedicated to determining the truth. Cassian sat frozen in his seat, his face ashen, as Justice Marsh continued outlining the tribunal's formal ruling. Effective immediately, Lord Cassian Vantros is stripped permanently of the title and all associated privileges of House Vantros, along with any claim to the estate's assets or property. Full title, estate, and all associated rights are hereby formally restored to Alira Vantros as the rightful and legitimate heir. Furthermore, given the severity of the fraud committed, Lord Cassian Vantros is sentenced to a period of formal imprisonment, the specific duration to be determined through separate proceedings that will also address the outstanding questions surrounding the deaths of his brother and sister-in-law. The chamber erupted into a wave of murmured reactions, though Alira, sitting quietly beside Rodarin, felt the announcement settle over her with a strange, overwhelming stillness, as though the enormity of the moment could not quite be fully absorbed all at once. 10 years of stolen identity, of buried grief and silent endurance, had finally, formally, been acknowledged and set right. Cassian was led from the chamber under guard, his earlier confidence entirely replaced by hollow, defeated silence, while Lady Miriam, seated among the observers, buried her face in her hands, the full weight of her own complicity finally catching up with her as well. Alira remained seated for a long moment after the chamber began to empty, processing the magnitude of everything that had just occurred. Rodarin's hand found hers gently, a quiet, steady point of connection amid the overwhelming swirl of emotion. "It is done," he said softly. "After 10 years, the truth has finally been acknowledged." Alira nodded slowly, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, though these tears carried none of the despair that had defined so many of her tears over the preceding decade. These were tears of release, of vindication, of a long, difficult chapter of her life finally, formally, drawing to its close. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to look at Rodarin properly, "for believing me, for everything you have done to bring me to this moment." Rodarin's expression softened into something warm and genuine, entirely unlike the careful, composed demeanor he typically presented to the world. "You owe me no thanks, Alira. You have done this yourself, through your own strength and resilience. I have simply had the honor of standing beside you while you reclaimed what was always rightfully yours." As they rose together to leave the chamber, stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight of the capital, Alira felt, for the first time in 10 long years, that she was finally, truly, stepping into a life that belonged entirely to her. The months that followed the tribunal's ruling brought a steady, if sometimes overwhelming, transformation to Alira's life. She returned to the Vantros estate, not as a servant, but as its rightful mistress, formally recognized before the entire kingdom, her name restored fully to the household records and public documents that had denied her identity for a decade. The early weeks proved challenging in their own way. There was much to learn about managing an estate of such significant size, matters of finance, of tenant relations, of the countless responsibilities that came with a title she had never been prepared to hold. She threw herself into this learning with the same quiet determination that had carried her through 10 years of hardship, seeking guidance from trusted advisors, including several former associates of her father, who came forward once word of her restoration spread, eager to assist the daughter of a man they had respected deeply. Bennett, upon learning of Alira's restoration, returned to the estate at her personal invitation, resuming his former position as head steward, his loyalty and wisdom proving invaluable as she navigated the unfamiliar responsibilities now resting upon her shoulders. Marta remained as well, though Alira insisted on treating her not merely as staff, but as the close friend she had become over the difficult years they had shared together. Colin, too, found his position within the household elevated significantly, his early kindness and quiet courage in helping Alira reach out to Rodarin during her darkest hour never forgotten. The household staff who had once treated her with casual indifference, unaware of her true identity, gradually adjusted to the reality of serving the very woman they had known, simply as a fellow servant for years. Most adapted with genuine warmth, several expressing quiet relief that the household's atmosphere, once heavy with the tension of Cassian's harsh rule, had shifted into something far more compassionate under Alira's gentle but firm guidance. News of Cassian's fate arrived gradually, over the following months. The separate investigation into the circumstances surrounding her parents' deaths continued, though conclusive proof connecting him directly to their fatal accident remained elusive. The mysterious Garrick Thorne, never located, despite extensive searching. Cassian himself remained in formal custody, his sentence for the proven fraud extending across several years, with his family's remaining assets, beyond what rightfully belonged to Alira, seized to compensate for the extensive damages caused by his decade of deception. Percival and Clarissa, stripped of the privileged life they had known, found themselves forced to build entirely new circumstances for themselves. Their previous social standing collapsed entirely in the wake of their father's public disgrace. Alira, despite everything she had endured at their hands over the years, found herself unable to fully abandon them to complete ruin, quietly arranging modest but sufficient support to ensure they were not left entirely destitute, a decision born not of forgiveness exactly, but of a hard-won understanding that cruelty, however justified it might feel, was not the foundation she wished to build her new life upon. Lady Miriam, facing her own separate legal consequences for her role in supporting Cassian's fraudulent claims, was ultimately sentenced to a lesser period of confinement, her cooperation with investigators during the later stages of the case earning her some measure of leniency compared to her husband's fate. Throughout this period of significant transition and adjustment, Roderick remained a steady, constant presence in Alira's life. What had begun as a debt of honor owed to her father's memory had, over the months following the tribunal, deepened gradually into something neither of them had initially anticipated, but both had come to recognize with quiet, growing certainty. He visited the estate frequently, ostensibly to assist with matters related to the ongoing legal proceedings, though both of them understood, without needing to speak the words aloud, that his visits had long since become about something far more personal than simple obligation. They spent long afternoons together, walking the estate's gardens, discussing matters both practical and personal, their conversations gradually revealing deeper layers of understanding and genuine affection between them. Alira found herself, for the first time in her life, allowing herself to imagine a future defined not by survival or hardship, but by genuine happiness, by partnership, by the possibility of building something meaningful alongside a man who had seen her, truly seen her, during the darkest, most invisible period of her existence, and had refused to look away. It was on a warm evening in early autumn, nearly 8 months after the dramatic events that had upended both of their lives, that Roderick requested a private audience with Alira, in the same gardens where they had spent so many quiet afternoons together over the preceding months. She found him standing near the same bench where Marta had once offered her quiet comfort during the uncertain weeks following her restoration, his expression carrying a rare vulnerability that immediately drew her attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, approaching him with quiet concern. "No," Roderick said, though his voice carried an unusual unsteadiness that was entirely unlike his typically composed demeanor. "Nothing is wrong, Alira. I simply find myself, for perhaps the first time in my life, uncertain of how to properly express something I have wanted to say to you for quite some time now." Alira waited patiently, curiosity and a growing hopeful anticipation building steadily within her chest. "When I first came to this estate," Roderick began slowly, "I believed my purpose here was simply to honor a debt owed to your father's memory, a soldier's duty to right a terrible wrong that had been committed against his family. That was my intention. When I first noticed the ring upon your wrist, when I first began investigating the truth of your circumstances." He paused, taking a slow, steadying breath before continuing. "But somewhere in the months since that first evening, my reasons for remaining close to you have shifted into something I did not anticipate. Something that has nothing whatsoever to do with debts owed or duties fulfilled. I have come to admire you, Alira, not simply for your resilience in the face of 10 years of hardship, though that resilience is remarkable in its own right, but for your quiet wisdom, your genuine compassion even toward those who wronged you, and the steady, thoughtful manner in which you have rebuilt not only your own life, but the lives of everyone within your household." Alira felt her breath catch, hardly daring to hope that she understood correctly the direction of his words. "I find myself," Roderick continued, his gray eyes steady and unwavering, despite the vulnerability evident in his voice, "wanting to build a future alongside you, not out of obligation or debt, but out of genuine devotion. "I have come to care for you deeply, Elira Vantros, and I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would consider allowing me to court you formally, with the full intention, should you find yourself amenable, of eventually asking for your hand in marriage." Tears, warm and unguarded, filled Elira's eyes as the weight of his words settled fully over her. 10 years ago, she had lost everything: her family, her identity, her very sense of self, reduced to invisibility within the walls of her own childhood home. Now, standing in the same gardens where she had once wept quietly over her impossible circumstances, she found herself being offered something she had never truly allowed herself to imagine possible. Genuine love, freely given, asked for nothing in return, beyond the simple honesty of her own heart's answer. "Yes," she said softly, her voice carrying quiet, unwavering certainty, despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Rodarin, I would be honored to allow you to court me. And I find myself, quite genuinely, hoping that such a courtship might indeed lead toward the future you have just described." Relief and quiet joy broke across Rodarin's features, a rare, unguarded smile transforming his typically composed expression into something warm and genuine. He reached for her hand gently, and Elira allowed him to take it, the simple, tender gesture carrying far more significance than either of them fully needed to express in words. They stood together in the quiet autumn garden as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and rose, and Elira felt, for the first time in over a decade, that her heart was finally, fully, at peace. Word of their courtship spread quickly throughout the kingdom over the following months, and their eventual engagement, announced formally at a grand celebration held within the very manor where Elira had once served as an invisible servant, drew guests from across the entire eastern region, many of them eager to witness the remarkable conclusion to a story that had captured the kingdom's attention for nearly a year. Standing once again in the grand hall of her family's estate, this time not as a servant preparing to be married against her will, but as a woman freely choosing her own future, beside a man who had proven, time and again, the depth of his genuine devotion, Elira reflected quietly on the long, difficult journey that had brought her to this moment. 10 years of servitude, of invisibility, of quiet, stubborn endurance in the face of cruelty and injustice, and yet, through it all, she had never fully lost the small, fragile hope her mother's final words had planted within her heart, all those years ago. Keep it safe. Keep it hidden. Wait for the time to be right. The time, Elira understood now, standing surrounded by loved ones who had supported her through the darkest and brightest moments of her extraordinary journey, had finally, truly arrived. She glanced down at her wrist, where the small golden ring bearing the crest of hawk and flame still rested, no longer hidden beneath careful layers of fabric, but worn openly and proudly, a permanent symbol of everything she had reclaimed, and everything still yet to come. Beside her, Rodarin took her hand once more, his pale gray eyes filled with quiet, steady devotion, and together, they faced the gathered crowd, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had already proven, beyond any doubt, that resilience, patience, and quiet, unwavering hope could ultimately triumph over even the deepest injustice. The girl who had once been treated as nothing more than an invisible maid within her own family's home had finally, fully, reclaimed her rightful place, not merely as a duchess-to-be, but as a woman who had survived the very worst of circumstances and emerged, ultimately, stronger, wiser, and more deeply loved than she had ever dared to imagine possible. Her story, one of quiet endurance rewarded, of justice finally served after 10 long years of silence, would be remembered throughout the kingdom for generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of hope, patience, and the unwavering belief that even the darkest circumstances could, given time and courage, ultimately give way to light.